We live in a fantasy world now. Reality has been destroyed.
This is the time that we really need to pay attention.
The probabilities are overwhelmingly on gold's side. That is the best environment to see gold increase its value.
Welcome to Palisade's Gold Radio. I'm your host, Tom Bodrovics. Joining me today is Stefan Gleason, president of Money Metals Exchange and also a director of the Sound Money Defense League. How are you today, Stefan?
I'm great, Tom, and it's great to be on your show again. I listen to virtually every show that you put out, so it's good to be back here.
Well, a long-time listener, what is it? Third time on the show here, right?
Yep.
Well, it's awesome to have you back, Stefan, and it's always good to have a conversation around, let's say, the legality and the minutia of owning precious metals, the taxation on them, which states are having sales tax still, and let's say all of the updates around any changes in that space, which I really appreciate you guys and being a part of the Sound Money Defense League, really going after and trying to advance the ease of which people can buy metals and not be taxed. For only one example, you guys really going after states' legislation around the metals like that. So
yeah,
I appreciate having this conversation with you today.
Yeah, it's a important cause to not just us as sound money people and as ideologues who believe in freedom and the free market, and also just understanding the founding principles of our country in the United States, and the fact that the gold and silver are part of the Constitution, part of our history, our monetary system, and really part of the solution long term. And as we look across the country and look at the policies, of course, a lot of the problems start at the federal level with the Federal Reserve System, the breakdown of the gold standard, and of course, the runaway deficit spending and the inflation monster that's been created by the current Keynesian economics-based system. And obviously there's some reforms that can and should be pursued there, and that's really, again, the root of the problem in the United States. But states do not have to sit idly by and be complete victims and sitting ducks to this federal problem, and nor do citizens. I mean, obviously, individual people can go on their own gold standard. That's what people are doing by buying gold and silver and saving it, storing it. It's something that's been happening at an accelerated rate in the United States over the last 3 years. It's a very encouraging thing. There's many hundreds of thousands or millions of additional people in the U.S. who are now acquiring gold and silver for the first time and having that as part of their asset mix. Money Metals Exchange being a dealer and depository, obviously we facilitate that for our customers. We have about half a million customers in the U.S. at this point, and we're U.S. focused. But beyond that, kind of coming from my political background in public policy before I launched Money Metals, and also just looking at how the public policies at the state level could be improved to benefit not just our customers, but to help promote sound money. And the number one problem that we see and saw, and it still exists, is taxation. It's the friction on the buying and the selling. And if you look at gold and silver and say, well, what is preventing gold and silver from returning to its role as money? Well, one of the biggest things in practical terms is the friction around the buying and the selling, the tax when you buy it and the income tax when you sell it. And so we've really started with those two policies with the Sound Money Defense League, and the Sound Money Index focuses probably about half of its scoring on whether a state has a sales tax on gold, silver, platinum, and palladium, and whether a state has exemptions on income tax for the sales when you later dispose of your gold and silver. You're taxed at the federal level, and then you're taxed again at the state level. Well, some states are backing out of that and saying, we're not going to tax this at the state level. Obviously, we'd like to see Mooney's bill at the federal level end that problem with the IRS and the federal income tax. But states can take some steps, and many states are. And so, we're seeing a lot of progress at the state level where public policy gains are much less difficult to achieve, particularly with mobilizing grassroots. Sound Money Defense League via email and Money Metals via its customer list are engaging in battles at the state level to support legislation to move the ball forward. And we're not done for the year, but we actually have 5 legislative victories this year already, which is probably going to be our best year. Ultimately, I think we've been involved in about 35 bills in over 20 states in this particular legislative session. And I can get into the different topics or areas, but that's sort of the overview of at least the legislative activities of the Sound Money Defense League.
So maybe let's start, let's say at the state level, for states that have ended sales tax this year on the purchase of gold and silver.
Yeah. So this year, so far, we've got one sales tax exemption bill that has been passed and signed into law, and that is Mississippi. Last year, we had Virginia and its partial exemption. It actually expanded the exemption to make it a full exemption in Virginia. We passed a new exemption in Tennessee last year, and I think I went on your show last year to talk about that. Other states before that, Arkansas and Ohio. 10 years ago, there were about 34 states that taxed precious metals purchases. That exempted precious metals purchases, and it's now 43. So we've passed 8 more sales tax exemptions in the last 9 or 10 years. Mississippi is our number one victory this year, and that law literally went into effect this week, July 1st. So purchasers of precious metals in Mississippi, whether they're buying from an in-state dealer or an out-of-state dealer, are now exempted from the sales tax. We've had bills this year also in Kentucky, Maine, Vermont, Wisconsin, and New Jersey. Wisconsin and New Jersey are still pending. In fact, New Jersey, a Democrat-controlled legislature, unanimously passed the sales tax exemption last week through the House, and it's now in the New Jersey Senate. I think it's called the Assembly in New Jersey. So it's now in the Senate, past the Assembly. Now it's in the Senate. Very, very optimistic there for another win this year. And then Wisconsin, we expect to have some hearings this fall. So we still have a shot at 2 more this year. Came very close in Kentucky and Maine. Vermont, nothing happened other than an introduction. But we're down to 7 states now. Literally just 7 states in the union. And then you include District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, but 7 states that still tax all purchases of precious metals. So we're getting pretty close. And what's interesting is as this number of exempt states expands, we're finding it less difficult to get those last ones. We're getting more momentum. Part of the reason is all 7 of these states, none of them have a bordering state that has a sales tax on gold and silver. So it strengthens the argument. So you're an island, and just to kind of get into the reasons why it makes no sense. Obviously, your listeners probably inherently understand and know most of these reasons already, but I'll review them. The first one is, gold and silver is money. It makes no sense to tax money. It's like taxing somebody on the exchange of 4 quarters for $1. When you're taxing somebody on the exchange in Federal Reserve notes for a gold coin, that's a constitutional money. It shouldn't be taxed either. So that's one kind of basic argument. Another is gold and silver is held for resale. Or exchange. And unlike other goods that are subject to the sales tax, they're not consumed. They're held for resale. They're, unless they're, rare coin, which is maybe arguably a different thing than a bullion coin from a sales tax standpoint. Some states actually tax the collectible version, but not the bullion. So there's some variation. But a bullion coin isn't, something that you're consuming. It's a store of value. It's money. And so you're holding it for resale. And the idea of sales tax is supposed to be on the end consumer of a good and not a reseller. So there's another argument. It's held for resale. It doesn't really even make sense to have a sales tax on purchase of gold and silver. And then you get into things like the fact that some states will lose business. People will leave the state to go across state lines to buy gold and silver. Businesses are struggling in those states, meaning like, dealers. A lot of them go out of business or they have to get into other things. And so for a variety of reasons, we've been finding real success there. And we're hopeful, as I mentioned, Wisconsin and New Jersey still could happen this year. But we will have bills in probably all the remaining states that still tax precious metals purchases. We'll probably have bills next year to stop that. I want to talk about the Maine case. We actually didn't expect to pass the bill through Maine this year, but we came very, very close. And it was an amazing display of political arm twisting and partisanship that ultimately defeated the bill. It's a Democrat-controlled legislature in Maine, and it was a Republican named Eric Brakey who introduced the bill in Maine to end the sales tax on precious metals. And there was just so much grassroots support for this bill that, and the arguments, of course, are very strong, that the Democrat-controlled committees were passing it out and bringing it to the floor for a vote. And ultimately, it was passing through these, initial readings and second vote, and then it got to the third vote, and the Democrats basically, I should back up. It passed the Senate 17-15, went over to the House. It passed the House on the first reading and the second reading. And then on the third reading, they postponed it to after the weekend. And the Democrat leadership spent the weekend twisting arms to get people who had voted for it on the second reading to flip their vote against it on the third reading. And our sponsor was told, this isn't about you. This is about power. This isn't about the bill. It's about power. The Democrats wanted to prove they still had control of the chamber. And they were using this as a way of proving that, because they had defeated every other consequential bill that the Republicans had brought forth. And they wanted to show they weren't losing control of the chamber. So it came up on the third vote in Maine, and it was defeated by one vote. They kept the vote open for 10 minutes as they were counting votes, and they got two people to flip, and it was defeated in Maine. It's interesting you juxtapose that with New Jersey, where it's a Democrat-controlled legislature, and it passed unanimously, and one of our sponsors is the Democrat majority leader. So, it's sometimes politics, enters into this, even though this is a policy that we've seen a lot of support from both parties on. But at the end of the day, I think people should be very encouraged that, at least on the sales tax front, we are winning battles every year, and it's only a matter of time before we're, wiping out all the sales tax that's imposed on purchases at the state level.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was actually something I wanted to ask you about, Stefan, is the idea that, Republicans and Democrats, that these battles happen across party lines just because they want to, impede the progress of the opposite party. Is that something that you see in a lot of the introduction of these types of bills?
Yeah, I would say not in a lot of them. But in some of them, the main example was an extraordinary example. You would have thought this was some major, gigantic bill like on abortion or guns or something. It turned out to be like the big political fight of the session, or at least one of two or three. But in many states, no, it's not partisan at all. I mean, we didn't pass ultimately in Hawaii, at least yet, but we passed it through the Hawaii House last year. And it was, again, very bipartisan. Mississippi was bipartisan. Of course, it's mostly a Republican-controlled state, certainly in terms of the legislature, but we got most Democrats to vote for it too. Mm-hmm. And, I don't know if that's because, obviously, that the idea of taxing money and taxing gold and silver, which is a form of savings that's particularly appealing to people who are small-time savers, who may not have access to stocks, bonds, real estate. It's a way for them to save, and to save in an inflation-resistant asset, so really the little guy benefits from an exemption on gold and silver purchases. And, if you look at the inflation issue in general, it's the people without assets who are most harmed, because inflation eats away at, people who are on a fixed income, their wages, their savings accounts. It's a tax on savers. It's diminishing the value of your savings. And so people who are small-time savers or pensioners or retirees or wage earners who don't own a house, who don't have access to stocks or don't have the resources, those are the people that are harmed the most by inflation, because they don't have the tangible assets to hedge. And so gold and silver is, something that everybody can access in small ways or larger ways. And so the idea that, if the Democrats are looking out for the little guy, then they should be all for, the idea of removing taxes and making it easier for people to acquire gold and silver as an inflation hedge, because arguably their constituency is most harmed. I don't think that often is what they really care about, but arguably they should for those reasons.
Mm-hmm. Well, explain to us about how the California system works and how that's particularly egregious to exactly that example that you brought up.
Yeah. So there's 6 states left that have a threshold on the sales tax. So it's a policy where they say if you make a purchase of over a certain amount, that's exempt, because that's maybe for a different purpose. But if you make it for a smaller amount, well, that's still taxed. And so again, that's a regressive tax on precious metals, the small time savers. California has a $1,500 threshold. It used to be $1,000 about 10 years ago, where all purchases of gold and silver below $1,000 are taxed. Purchases in one transaction, purchases of $1,000 or more were not taxed. Then they have something in their regulation that allows them to raise thresholds and targets based on inflation. And so 10 years ago, they raised it to $1,500. And then just this year, the California bureaucrats said, well, now it's $2,000 because of inflation, of course. And so therefore, if you make a $1,900 purchase of gold and silver, you're taxed, whereas a year ago you were not. There's a few other states that have this stupid, mechanism. We call it the threshold states. Maryland, New York, Connecticut, Florida, and Massachusetts, I believe, are the remaining ones. We had one in Virginia, but we got it removed. So now everything's exempt in Virginia. But those are sort of the second type of exemptions. They're the ones that don't cover every type of transaction. There's a state, Minnesota, will have an exemption. They have an exemption on on bars and rounds, but not coins. And there was a bill this year to expand the sales tax exemption to apply to coins. So like gold eagles, for example, are coins. They're taxed in Minnesota. A gold bar is not. So you have sort of these screwy policies from state to state. But pretty much every state, every year we're moving forward. We only lost a couple, but we got them back over the last 10 years. We briefly lost the Ohio exemption. We briefly lost the Louisiana exemption, but that's back. There was an incident this year, actually, just last month, where the Republicans or members of the legislature had proposed to remove a whole bunch of sales tax exemptions, and ours was included in that removal. We sent out a letter to our customers in Louisiana and emails, and I actually got a tweet from the House Assistant Speaker complaining of the hundreds of phone calls that he was getting from our people. And I said, well, I tweeted back, it was all public. I tweeted back, said, then remove this part of the bill and we'll be fine. He's like, oh, great. So, if I do what you say, then you will stop, making people, call us and attack me. And it's like, yeah, well, pretty much. And then he actually, it was interesting because he made an issue out of the fact that my company is based in Idaho, and thinking like, oh, you have no right. Who are you? And, of course, we have thousands of customers in Louisiana. And I happen to also have an office in Charlotte, which is just a short plane flight to Louisiana. So he actually tweeted at me, well, let's just discuss it. Why don't you come into my office at 11 a.m. this morning? And I was like, okay. He didn't think I could accept because he thought I was in Idaho. But anyway, we had a very heated, I showed up, we had a very heated but productive discussion. And at the end of the day, they offered an amendment to remove the sales tax part from the bill. Or I'm sorry, the precious metals part from the bill. So it was very productive, but it also shows the power of the grassroots, because that wouldn't have happened if we hadn't had hundreds of people calling.
Isn't that interesting, though? He's supposed to be a representative for the people in his state. That is, theoretically how democracy is supposed to work. And it's a problem for him to hear from the people that he is supposed to be representing. Just amazing how that works.
Well, I think, the politicians, it's interesting. This is a little bit to the nature of politicians. Their goal is, they get elected to promote their ideas, not yours. Hopefully, somebody's elected who's in sync with yours, but they're really about promoting their own ideas. And they're also about not having
more local ideas of where they are based, right?
Often that, or maybe they're an ideologue, or maybe they're a Marxist and they want, or whatever, or a libertarian or whatever. So the point is that, they want to kind of do what they want to do, and they don't necessarily inherently like hearing from constituents. And that usually represents a problem. That represents they need to pay attention to what's happening there, because ultimately it can impact their reelection, and they want to remain in office so they can promote their own ideas. So when you have grassroots that is knocking on your door, making phone calls, sending emails, it gets your attention. One of the first things the politicians might do is ignore that, pretend it's not happening, hope you go away. And many people get discouraged and say, they're not listening, I'm just going to stop. There's no hope. Mm-hmm. And I guess my point on this is it really does work, because that suggests they have a problem. They have potential, repercussions electorally, and you're going to get better behavior by making noise and contacting than just assuming that you're never going to have an impact. And so I can tell you that these battles that we've been winning are largely because of the grassroots that have been engaging, that have been making phone calls, sending emails. I would say at least half of these bills would not have passed if it weren't for significant grassroots support. And these aren't even that controversial. Mm-hmm. There really isn't organized opposition on the other side. Nobody really objects to these bills. They may not understand them. They may not care about gold and silver or sound money, but there's no entrenched constituency that is lobbying on the other side. And so that makes it also more possible for us to achieve wins. It's not a controversial policy, but whenever you're moving legislation, it is a process and it's difficult. And there's so many ways they can stop you along the way. And even if it's not deliberate, it's just, there's thousands of bills introduced in each state in each year. And moving those bills through, getting the committee hearings, getting the votes, getting it over to the other side. A lot of bills will die, after passing on one side, it'll die on the other. So that's what happened in Kentucky. We passed it through the Kentucky House. We've been working on the House for the last 3 years. We finally passed it through the House, went over to the Senate, and it died. However, we now have pretty much the House on board every year, we hope, to pass this bill. And now we can work on the Senate, and maybe, we'll get them in the next couple of years and then have the governor sign it. That's kind of how it happened in Tennessee. That was about an 8-year battle. And it finally got through both chambers. Same with Mississippi. It was a 3-year battle, and it finally got through both chambers. So it's not easy, but with the grassroots taking the action, it really has been making a big difference.
Mm-hmm. So, Stefan, let's talk a little bit about, or the only thing I wanted to cover at the state level is if, let's say, somebody lives in a state that still has sales tax, if they go out of the state, buy their metal and get it, either they bring it back or they get it shipped in. Yeah. Are they exempt at that point, or is it kind of a don't tell situation? Yeah. And what about storage out of state as well?
Okay, so that's the great questions. Okay, so it's called the sales and use tax in most states. So the sales tax is a mandate on the business to collect at the point of sale. Mm-hmm. The use tax is an obligation that individual taxpayers have inherently and are supposed to report purchases they made, whether it be in the state or from out of state that they brought back to the state, that should be taxed under the use tax. So technically, most people, virtually nobody knows this, virtually nobody does this. But technically, if you're in a sales tax state that has a use tax component, which I think pretty much they all do, and you went to a tax exempt state and made the purchase and then brought it back into the state, at the end of the year, you're supposed to report that and pay the sales tax or the use tax on it. Mm-hmm. Again, most people don't know that they have this. Well, you're not a U.S. taxpayer, but most people would not even realize that on their state income tax return, there's something usually that talks about unpaid use taxes, and you're supposed to report that. You're supposed to collect your receipts all year, including from merchants in the state, and make sure they charge you the correct tax. And if they don't charge you enough tax, you're supposed to report that yourself. Mm-hmm. So the fact of the matter is people don't, they just go to another state, they bring it back in, or they go to an online dealer who has a depository like Money Metals and stores it in that depository, because the tax is based on where it's ultimately delivered. And so if, Idaho, for example, is an exempt state and our depository is in Idaho. So somebody who's in an state tax, sales tax state like Vermont, could open a depository account at a place like Money Metals Depository, buy the metals there, and then store them there. But if we ship it to Vermont, we have to charge a sales tax. So yeah, that's your answer. It's based on where it's delivered or taken to. And so in the case of bringing it back into a state.
Right. So then is there any particular motivation for states to keep charging sales tax other than just, being able to collect more tax?
Yeah, I mean, the fiscal notes that come with our bills. So when a bill goes through that has a tax impact, it's supposed to get what's called a fiscal note, which the tax commission is usually asked, what is the impact of this? How much revenue is going to be lost by this? They don't necessarily consider how much revenue will be gained through, for example, greater business activity as a result of the action, or new coin conventions coming to the state and bringing tourism dollars, that kind of thing. They just look at how much are we going to lose in taxes if we exempt these purchases. But I'm pleased to say that in most cases, these fiscal notes are very small. Now, they may be underestimating in some cases. We're not concerned by that. We're happy to have them, be conservative. But often these fiscal notes are, several $100,000, maybe $1 million, maybe $3 million. I think in Wisconsin, there's a $3 million fiscal note. That's a pretty large state. I can tell you that Money Metals collects quite a bit of sales tax for the state of Wisconsin. It's one of the largest sales tax states that remain. So there's $3 million, $300,000, whatever the loss to the state might be, pretty inconsequential in the large scheme of things, especially when the whole idea of sales tax makes no sense in the first place. It's constitutional money, but that is a factor. And, sometimes that is the reason that a bill dies is, it's got $1 million fiscal note and they want to spend it on, that means we have to cut spending or raise taxes somewhere else.
So then, and that's at the state level, that's on top of the federal taxes that you have to pay on that. So is that right?
Well, there's no sales tax federally. So the tax federally would be when you sell the income tax. And that gets into Congressman Mooney's bill, the Monetary Metals Tax Neutrality Act, which would clarify that gold and silver should not be taxed under the income tax. Right now, mostly, really explicitly because of the IRS's interpretation, not because of statute. But the IRS takes the position that when you sell your gold and silver, that's property, and they consider it a collectible. And they say that you have to pay the collectibles income tax rate, which is 28%. So it's even higher than a stock or a bond. A long-term capital gain on a stock or a bond is only, or real estate is only at the federal level 15 or 20%, depending on your tax bracket. But collectibles is 28%. And they consider gold and silver bullion to be a collectible. So that's a pretty significant impediment to selling. It's one reason why borrowing against gold might be something that people consider if they have a lot of capital gains, where you can, in some places, including Money Metals, you can get a loan against your gold if you want that liquidity, but don't want to actually have to sell it. And so if you're sitting on a lot of capital gains in gold and silver, that's something to consider. But of course, some people just don't report it, and we certainly don't recommend that. Not something to trifle with. Not reporting income. Yeah. And at the state level, now states will often, there's 5 states that don't have an income tax, but the rest that do, they basically start with your federal adjusted gross income, and then they subtract things and they add things. And so there are states such as Arizona, and then this year, Arkansas, which just passed a law that we supported and were involved with, that exempts gold and silver from the income tax. And so some states now, and that's sort of tier 2. Sales tax was tier 1. We're almost done. We've got 7 more states. Tier 2, in terms of this friction around buying and selling, obviously the income tax. At the state level, that's kind of the new frontier for this, for the sound money efforts, I'd say, is to remove the income tax from people when you sell your gold and silver. And several states have done so. We had several other bills this year that tried to do so as well. That didn't pass yet. But we did get one this year, and that was Arkansas.
Mhm. So then, there's a couple other, let's say, bills that Representative Mooney is a part of here. There was recently a bill introduced that would facilitate the repegging of the dollar to a fixed weight of gold bullion. So tell us a bit more about that one, if you can.
Yeah, that's called the Gold Standard Restoration Act, and it simply reverses the actions by the Nixon administration after a 2-year period, I believe, in advance of refixing the Federal Reserve note to a certain fixed weight of gold. Obviously, the price will have to be fixed at a way, way higher rate. At the time, it was $35 an ounce when there was a peg that we defaulted on the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1971. And that led to a massive boom in money printing, inflation, and debt in the United States. And so part of the question is, how do you get back to that? One is to just move to a gold monetary system entirely, which is probably preferable. But if you want to go back to the idea of the paper money linked to gold, then you would have to relink it at a new price. And what the Mooney bill would do, basically, before it relinks the price, it would allow for a period of adjustment where information would be released by the federal government on the status of the U.S. gold reserves, transactions that have taken place involving the gold reserves of the United States, and including both before and after Bretton Woods. There was a huge flurry of transactions. Lots of countries were pulling gold out of the United States in the 60s, turning in their Federal Reserve notes, taking gold back. There was very large purchases even from African central banks, which may have been wealthy individuals going to African central banks who had the privilege of redeeming Federal Reserve notes, and maybe they're using these African central banks as conduits. So, there's a lot of information that hasn't been released about all that flurry of activity, where gold went before that. But then, since then, is the U.S. involved in gold swaps, leases, bonds? Well, obviously not bonds, but they're involved in potentially transactions through the International Monetary Fund, the Bank of International Settlements. To what extent has our gold been mobilized? Is it encumbered? Are there claims against it? It may still be at Fort Knox or the Federal Reserve in New York, but is it encumbered by any other obligations? Mm-hmm. And so all of that is supposed to be released. And then after a period of time, and that would allow the market price to adjust, by the way, and other factors, including the fact that we might be going back on a gold standard, would play into the market price of gold, and then it would be refixed at the then market price from then forward. And that's what that bill does. It's obviously a very ambitious bill, but Congressman Mooney wanted to. He's very much a sound money champion, really. He's been promoting these ideas for years. Since Ron Paul left, nobody's done more on the sound money issue at the federal level than Congressman Mooney. He's now running for Senate. He's running for the seat in West Virginia, where Senator Manchin, the yellow dog Democrat, is potentially running for re-election, and so he'll be facing off against Congressman Mooney, hopefully this next year. But yeah, Mooney's been doing a lot on many fronts.
Do you think that would actually, repegging the dollar to a gold standard would actually help curb inflation and constrain government spending?
Yeah, ultimately, the governor on the expansion of the money supply was, up until the breach of the Bretton Woods Treaty, was the redeemability feature. Obviously, we went off the gold we went off private ownership of gold in 1933. FDR did that, but we still had a dollar redeemability, at least for central banks, and that created pressure on Congress to be fiscally responsible. And as they became more and more irresponsible in the 60s, many countries were taking us up on that redemption ability and turning in their Federal Reserve notes for gold. And gold was leaving the U.S. Treasury at very rapid rates. I think we lost several thousand tons of gold through that mechanism. So rather than shore up the finances, be fiscally responsible, balance the budget, they instead just breached the treaty. But ultimately, that's why the system as it stands today is something the politicians love so much, because there's no accountability. They don't have to raise taxes. and they don't have to cut spending.
Mhm.
They just run a deficit, and then they offload it to the Federal Reserve, who buys the bonds, monetizes the debt, and that results in inflation. And the first user of that newly created money is the government. And so they benefit the most from it. And of course, if you look beyond, the other pressures on the government, inflation benefits debtors, it harms savers. The federal government is one of the largest debtors on the globe. It's $33 trillion. And of course, all these obligations, which are denominated in dollars, they can default upon these by not actually defaulting through inflation. And so the government benefits from inflation right now. So this system is obviously pretty corrupt, broken. But the Mooney bill would be one way of solving it.
So, audits are also part of that bill. And it's always seems to be kind of a hot topic from people that say it is audited or that it isn't audited. So what is your understanding of where the audit situation sits on the Treasury's gold?
Yeah, well, there hasn't been a credible audit for about 70 years, since the 1950s. There have been audits. There were some audits even in the last 20 years. But there's an emphasis on physical audits, mm-hmm. to the extent audits have been done. And, my concern is that, even if the metal is there, what other obligations or encumbrances does it have? Mm-hmm. And, arguably, okay, if somebody owns, if it's in the U.S. government controlled vault, well, we can just default on that obligation if it's been pledged to someone else or whatever. They say, okay, we want the gold. We say, well, too bad, we changed our mind. We have that ability, I suppose, if it's in our vaults. But the audits that have been done, which are not routine, they audit the seals of the compartments every year to see if they've been broken. And at Fort Knox, there's a number of compartments. They have had a couple of sort of show audits where they brought in a congressman or the Treasury secretary or whatever. They just they come out, yep, the gold's there. We saw it. It was all So there's not a credible and transparent process for physically auditing the metal on a routine basis every few years. I mean, it's a lot of metal, so it would take, I don't think it needs to be done every year. Mooney has a bill that would say it has to be done every 5 years. But part of that audit includes not just an inventory, but an assay, meaning, looking at the bars and taking a sample and doing some random checking. But then probably most fundamentally, looking at the encumbrances that may in the transaction side, an accounting of all the transactions that may have occurred. I think that's really where the problem is, if there is a problem. It's on, to what extent have we mobilized our gold, even if it may still be there, and put it in harm's way, added credit risk, done other things with it. So and then there never has been a disclosure of that in any kind of, formal way. Mm-hmm. So Mooney's bill would require that as part of the audits. Mm-hmm.
So do you think the argument can be made that there's an advantage to being a bit more mysterious with gold holdings of a central bank, kind of like other Eastern countries?
That's a good, arguably it could hurt. It could be if there are problems with our gold, then it could be a problem to have that become known. And maybe that's the issue. But we do say how many ounces of gold we own. That number is there. I think it's about 8,000 tons. It's about, at the statutory price of $35 an ounce, I think it's about 700 billion worth of gold. So that number does exist. We say what it is, at $35 an ounce, by the way. Yeah. No, I'm sorry. I'll have to check on that. What the amount is. I could be wrong on the amount.
42 or something like that.
Yeah, well, that it did move up to 42 at the very end. But in terms of what the market value of the gold is versus the statutory value, I can't recall the exact number there. Mm-hmm. But we have about 8,000 tons, and it is reported, and we do have bar lists and so forth. That stuff does exist from the inventories that have been done in the past. Mm-hmm. So I think that's we should have a mechanism for verifying that those numbers are real and that there aren't encumbrances, and we don't.
So this kind of brings us to another idea of talking about the federal level. There's another bill that was recently introduced that was basically talking about being against a CBDC, Stefan. And if we could,
Yeah.
let's go through a little bit of the minutia of, you and I had the conversation before we hit record today about the idea that the FedNow, what that is, and this introduction of this bill against a CBDC.
Yeah, so I believe we have people conflating the FedNow idea with a central bank digital currency.
Mm-hmm.
My understanding of the FedNow rollout is that it's an upgrade to the very primitive ACH transaction system that's been in effect since the 60s. It's a terrible system. I can tell you as a business owner, particularly one where, people are, there are people involved in fraud and trying to make purchases of precious metals with stolen bank accounts and so forth. There's not a good system for verifying identities behind bank accounts. And this is, just from the standpoint of a merchant, like there is with credit cards, who the person is, you can verify and so forth. But bank account numbers are not as easily verified as being, who the owners are. And so there's a lot more fraud potential. There's also a very slow clearing process. And so that system, my understanding of FedNow is it's literally just dramatically speeding up the clearing time between banks when it comes to payments that are made through what today is called the ACH system. Central bank digital currency idea is a much more sweeping and sort of draconian idea of literally having a trackable currency where every transaction is sourced and can be centrally, viewed to every person and what they bought, where they bought it, how much money they have, and theoretically the ability to deactivate people. Like in China, they're already developing this. It's a totalitarian idea that is getting a lot of traction in China, and it adds on to the social credit system and other things that they have to control from the top down the behaviors of their citizens. And so something like that being promoted by a central bank like the Fed is very concerning. I'm not sure even the banking system supports the idea. In some ways, it cuts them out completely or at least partially out of the entire financial system, where everything is sourced back to a uni currency that is trackable and controlled. And again, somebody runs afoul of the powers that be. They can be cut off from their savings. They can have all of their transactions, be fully transparent that they've ever done, all in one place. So that's the idea of central bank digital currency. They're doing it in China. Congressman Mooney has a bill that is against. It's no pilot program for central bank digital currency. It basically prohibits the Fed from being involved in any kind of research or development involving a CBDC. Mm-hmm. And so that bill was introduced about a month ago, and it has a number of co-sponsors. Now, the Fed has said publicly, I don't think there's anything that's stopping them, but they have said that they're not doing any of this, that they're not planning on doing any of this bill. So therefore, the bill is unnecessary in their view because they don't plan to do it. Obviously, you can't take their word for it. They may well be doing it to some extent. I mean, they're not doing rulemaking on it, but there may be research, there may be some projects. And so the idea of this bill is to say no funding, no activities, you won't be doing any of this. And some states have already done some things on their own on this topic. Governor DeSantis did a regulation that said the state won't be involved in a central bank digital currency. And I think they even specifically said that under the Uniform Commercial Code in Florida, that we will not recognize a transaction that was settled using a central bank digital currency. So essentially just cuts the legs out from using such a scheme. And then North Carolina passed a bill last month, 2 months ago, through one house, hasn't passed through the other, that would prohibit the governor and the executive branch from doing anything to support, assist, research, accept payment in, any of that kind of stuff involving a central bank digital currency. So, and there's many other states that are looking at such bills. I think there is a real concern that the Fed will do this, and they'll basically take a page out of China's playbook, because that's what totalitarians do. That's what top-down managers do. They want to control, and this is an ultimate kind of control mechanism. And I think we're going to be able to stop it, at least for a while. and especially as we see how China is using it. But that's what Congressman Mooney's bill would do on that.
I'd like to kind of touch on one of the other topics that is, kind of related to spending your gold and silver. You and I were both recently kind of part of this idea of introducing a bill in Texas to make gold and silver legal tender, as well as being able to have that gold and silver linked to a type of debit or credit card.
Right.
And this kind of brings up the idea of being able to spend your gold and silver. We've talked plenty on the show about these different programs, but you kind of shared with me your ideas on what makes these types of programs attractive and or exciting or not exciting to you.
Yeah.
So, if we could let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So people want to move back to a system that allows for gold and silver to be used as money again. I support that idea. I believe gold and silver is money. Part of the reason we're involved in the Sound Money Defense League is to promote the idea of gold and silver as money, remove the friction around what makes it hard to become or be money, such as the taxes on the buying and the selling. At the end of the day, though, at least in today's market, and I'm not saying it won't come to this, but today, I personally, I don't necessarily want to spend my gold and silver. For me, that's my savings. And there's something called Gresham's Law, which, an aspect of that is that bad money pushes out the good money and pushes out the good money from circulation. So we saw that with the pre-1965 dimes, quarters, and half dollars. Once they introduced the copper-clad equivalents, the silver dimes, quarters, and half dollars went into private hoards. It took a while. People, especially it started accelerating in the 70s with the inflation. And now today, $1 face value of dimes, quarters, and half dollars is worth about $20 in silver, if they're the silver ones. If they're not, they're worth $1. And so it's a very easy, obvious sort of example of inflation and what's occurred in just 50 years. But this is a concept that the bad money stays in circulation, the good money is put into private hoards and becomes a savings, a form of savings. So I am not personally interested in spending my gold. I would be happy. Of course, I buy it. I would sell it. Don't really sell my gold either personally. And that's kind of what spending it is. It's a sale. It's a sale for something else. And part of the reason I'm not interested in doing that is because I can still use Federal Reserve notes pretty much everywhere. That's convenient, even though I don't keep a lot of those because they don't hold value. But it's convenient. And also there's a tax issue. There's a tax basis that's involved. If you're going to comply with the tax laws, and I think people should, you have to track your basis on that gold and silver. And so every time you spend your gold and silver, you're engaging in a taxable transaction. Whether you have gains or losses, you have to track that. I know software can make that less difficult. Maybe that you get a report from the platform, but again, it's on your tax return. You have to pay taxes on it, or maybe you get a deduction if you had a loss. So there's a lot of friction. I'm comfortable with borrowing against gold to get liquidity, obviously saving gold, but spending it. And I think that's the problem. Right now, there is not a very good business case for that kind of thing to go viral. Now, that doesn't mean that at some point it won't, in a total breakdown scenario. But even then, maybe people will be more comfortable with spending the physical money as opposed to an app-enabled form of it or a Visa card-enabled form of it. And so I think that's why this is struggling to take on, to sort of gain momentum. I'm not against the idea, of course, anything that makes gold more useful and silver more useful and transactable is good, but I just don't know that it's something that's going to take off, at least until and unless we get to a point where it's the only payment that somebody will accept, or a payment that somebody gives you a discount if you use it, that kind of thing. At that point, then I think you get a tipping point. And obviously you need the technologies, you have to have the mechanisms in place, and there's lots of different ideas out there. I just think it's a difficult thing. And the people that want to spend their gold and silver are usually just doing it for an ideological reason at this point. It's not necessarily a practical business case kind of reason. And when that changes, that's when something like that can be adopted widely. But right now, I don't see it.
Yeah, thanks for sharing your thoughts on that, Stefan. That's all I have on my topics list here to talk to you about today. Is there anything else that you wanted to add before we wrap up here?
No, I believe we covered things pretty well. On the policy side, if you want to get involved in the Sound Money Defense League, get on the list. Go to soundmoneydefense.org and get on the email list, or you can go to moneymetals.com, get on that email list. We are able to, send out alerts to people based on a bill that may be coming up in their state and give them very specific things to do at a time when it can make a difference. And I can't say it enough, but I mean, this grassroots is significantly responsible for the successes that we're having. And so I really urge people to, if they're interested in pursuing this and helping in their state or just in general, go to moneymetals.com and get on the email list, or go to soundmoneydefense.org and get on the email list. Excellent.
And of course, on Twitter @moneymetals as well.
That's right. Thank you.
Stefan, thanks so much for your time and your update on all these legalities, and also your hard work on all these topics.
Thank you.
I'm sure the entire precious metals community is very appreciative of your guys' efforts on this.
Thank you, Tom. It's a pleasure to be here again.
Thank you. Look forward to the next time. This podcast is for general informational purposes only. Nothing on this podcast should be taken as investment advice. Guests on this show are not compensated for their appearance. Listeners are urged to educate themselves and make their own decisions. Do not base any investment decisions on the information contained. To view our full disclaimer, please visit our website.